All right. We're going to go ahead and get started, everybody. Trevor, I'm going to mess with your. I will turn it back down again. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you can find your seats, thank you so much. Amazing to see all these amazing faces in the room. Thank you so much for being here. For folks online, thank you so much for joining us in that format as well. My name is Cinnamon Moffat. I'm the Associate Director of Marine Research with Oregon State University here at Hatfield, located in Newport, Oregon. And this is a hybrid event, so we have folks online and folks in the room. So I'm going to go through a couple of logistics, and then we're going to kick this off. So for folks online, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them into the chat box. We have a wonderful volunteer here, Roseanne, who will make sure that she'll read out your questions and we can get those answered. Also, if you have any technical issues, if you can't hear, you can't see, please let us know so we can get that fixed before we go too far along. For folks in the room, when we get to question and answer, in order for folks online to be able to interact with us, you will need a mic to ask your question so they can hear. So all I ask is that when we get to that question and answer, go ahead and raise your hand. And I or Mariana right here, that was a quiet little wave, Mariana. There we go, bow, curtsy. We'll bring a mic to you so that our online folks can participate as well. I also wanted to let folks know this is our last Science on Tap for this year. We'll start again in the new year. We'll take a little break in December because holidays take up everybody's time, but we hope to see you again. So thank you so much for being here. It's excited to see so many folks in the room. So I'm going to actually hand the mic off to the director of the Marine Mammal Institute and the interim director and AVP of Hatfield, Lisa Balance, who's going to introduce our speaker because she was the one that drug him down here. So we're so excited. Lisa, here.
Thanks, Cinnamon. And I echo Cinnamon's sentiments. It's fantastic to see so many people here in person and so many people online for what is surely to be a spectacular talk. Again, my name is Lisa Balance. I'm the director of the Marine Mammal Institute, and I'm also the interim executive director of Hatfield Marine Science Center, associate vice president of marine research operations. So proud to be in all of those roles. I love Hatfield. And it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Trevor Branch. Dr. Branch is a full professor in the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Science at the University of Washington. He's a computer modeler and synthesist who uses math and modeling to solve biological problems. Research projects that he and his lab have worked on include assessing the global status and future directions of marine fisheries, testing hypotheses about how fisheries affect marine food webs, and detecting factors that influence patterns in fishery development. His projects include the human side of fisheries, including fishing behavior and fleet dynamics and their impact on the environment. And his projects include a wide array of other topics, including ocean acidification, gigantism in marine ecosystems, overlooked pathways to extinction, black swan events in animal populations, and devising efficient Bayesian algorithms. Now, don't be afraid because he's not going to talk about math tonight. I and the Marine Mammal Institute here at Hatfield and all of you are interested in his whale research. And indeed, his past and current projects have focused on abundance, status, and subspecies separation of blue whales, the hypothesis that baleen whales that flee killer whales call at frequencies too low for killer whales to hear, and the idea that blue whale calf sightings are rare because they have adapted the timing and location of births and weaning to avoid killer whale predation. Intriguing. In total, Dr. Branch has published more than 120 papers in the scientific literature, and he's writing a book on blue whales. He has a full day of meetings with us in the Marine Mammal Institute tomorrow, and he's giving us another science seminar at noon. We are thrilled to host you here, Dr. Branch. But tonight, he will present Fear, the impact of killer whales on baleen whales. And he writes, the biggest whales surely rule the world, don't they? Surprisingly, this is not true. New understanding of orca attacks and the fear they cause in baleen whales may have shaped where and how whales migrate, how they sing, and their growth rates, among many other aspects of their behavior, ecology, and evolution. So, Trevor, we're thrilled to have you come on up and tell us about this.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was a very flattering introduction. I just so you know, I'm not going to try and advance towards the audience because I'm apparently trapped in this blue box here, so they can see me on the video up there. A lot of this work I'm talking about today came as many scientific ideas come purely by serendipity. So the concept that scientists sit around and they're like, I am going to work on this and it's going to turn out this way. Sometimes, some kinds of science, yes. A lot of the time, the most interesting ideas come purely by chance, and this is how this arose for sure. And I'll get into that towards the end of the talk, how this actually arose. So the thing with baleen whales is this. It's very, very hard to gather data on them. So when I talk about baleen whales, these are the ones that don't have big teeth. They just have these sheets of baleen to allow them to filter out food. And the problem is it's hard to figure out what they do and where they go because they surface for only a very short amount of time. And it's very difficult to find them. And a lot of species are sparsely spread out over a very, very wide area. So unless you're someone like Bob Pittman, who's spent like 6 months at sea for his whole life and has seen almost every species of whale, you probably aren't going to see very many whales if you just go out to a random spot in the ocean. So here are some of the questions that we don't really have a decent explanation. Why are they so big? Why do they migrate? Why do some species migrate to the same places every year in an enclosed area and other species disperse during winter? Where are all the missing whale babies? And why is whale song deep and loud, but only for some species and not for others? And somehow I'm going to wrap all of these together using killer whales, if you haven't figured that out already. Okay, so I'm going to try and convince you today that for baleen whales, the answer to life and the universe and everything is orcas. Specifically, a very deep fear of mammal-eating orcas like the transients or big killer whales that we see off our coast here in the Pacific Northwest. So for example, here, it's not one of our orcas, it's a mammal-eating orca off Bremer Bay in Western Australia, taken out the tongue of a blue whale, a doomed blue whale. Okay, and this particular part of orcas has maybe perhaps not specialized in eating blue whales, but they have on many occasions targeted and killed blue whales. So how do we know that killer whales are even important? There's been quite a lot of research on this, and one way is when we look at pictures of blue whale, of many different species of whales, we can see these rake marks, like you can see in these pictures, that are from killer whale teeth, where they grab onto the tail and the whale escapes, leaving behind these marks that look just like a garden rake going along the ground. And we see these rakes in, for example, 17% on average of humpback whales, and this varies quite a lot from region to region. They're almost always acquired when they are calves. So not a lot of adults get them after they're all grown up. So it seems like most of the attacks happen on calves. Most of the successful attacks that we see are either on the calves or they're on adults of the smaller species, such as minke whales and gray whales. In our particular region here in the Eastern North Pacific, there are rake marks on 42% of gray whales, on 19% of humpback whales, and 20% of blue whales. So even the biggest species are not immune to being at least attacked by killer whales. Also, where these rake marks occur differs from species to species. So humpbacks and gray whales tend to have rake marks on the trailing edge, the back part of their flukes, the tails, you can see in this example, whereas blue whales tend to have more on the leading edge of their flukes. So they seem to be attacked in different ways. Fin whales too also can display rake marks. Here are some fin whale pictures from the Southeast Pacific or Chile, where just around 3% of fin whales have these rake marks. And I don't know if someone can tell me why there's a hole in the dorsal fin of that fin whale. I'd appreciate it. Bob. Cookie cutter sharks. That is cool. For those that don't know what cookie cutter sharks are, look it up. They're also called the demon whale biters. Okay. Now, one of the problems with using rake marks to figure out predation proportion is this: it's survivorship bias. We only see the whales that survived the attacks. We don't see the whales that died. And there's the classic example of survivorship bias is this figure. Maybe some of you have seen this. This is from a very famous study of World War II airplanes flying back after battle. And the UK wanted to know under what circumstances do planes get shot down, and where do we need to put armor on our planes? Okay, and so each plane came back and they took note of where the bullet holes were, and they said, oh, look, the bullet holes are all, concentrated in these particular areas. Therefore, we should armor the places where the bullet holes are not. Right? Because that's where the planes got shot down and didn't come back. Okay. Now, a side note to this is actually that this particular figure and a couple of derivatives are not the positions of the bullet holes on these planes. This figure was created by Cameron Moll in the 1980s because he needed an illustration of survivor bias, and so he opened up his thing and he added a few points on planes and was like, this will be good, and that became the classic figure of the study. The actual study, if you look it up, is like 100 pages of math with no figures at all. Okay. Now, attacks of killer whales on baleen whales have been documented on almost every species that's out there. They've been documented on blue whales, fin whales, sei whales, Bryde's whales, minke whales, humpback whales, gray whales, bowheads, right whales, and probably more than we even know. 20 species at least of different types of cetaceans in all. And calves are particularly targeted. Here's a photo that Bob just sent me this week that I had to put in. It's a minke whale getting flung virtually out of the water, minke whale calf getting flung virtually out of the water by a killer whale in the process of a successful attack in the North Pacific. Now, minke and gray whales are by far the most commonly predated on. Numerous occasions, minke whales have been seen attacked and killed in all oceans of the world. Gray whales are particularly attacked off Monterey Bay, and as they pass through Univ Island, going into the Bering Sea. So there are these spaces where the killer whales know to aggregate and congregate and target them, and it's particularly their calves. Okay, so I hope I've established that killer whale predation is real. And even if it isn't that common, the fear of killer whales can lead things to change their behavior and to evolve in response to that predation pressure. Okay, so why are baleen whales so big? Well, one way you can escape predation is by being too big. Okay? The bigger you are, the harder it is to take you down. And it's, of course, notable that the two with the most attacks are minke whales and gray whales, two of the smallest species of baleen whales. So you get big enough, you can perhaps escape predation by being too unwieldy to take care of. How do you get big? You get big by growing very, very, very fast, very, very, very quickly, to limit the window of opportunity when you're the right size for killer whales to attack. So this is a plot of fetal growth rate in utero before you get born. Those are the baleen whale species. The other points are every species of mammal in the world, terrestrial and land-based. So all of the fastest growing fetal growth rates in the world are baleen whales. And in case you think, well, that's just because they're big, well, here are the biggest land-based mammals, rhinos, elephants, giraffes, hippos, perfectly in the middle of everything else. They get big by having a longer gestation period. And in case you think, well, that's just because they are marine mammals are different, they don't need to support their weight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the average of all the other marine mammal species. So all the seals and dolphins and so on and so forth. Okay, so you grow fast in utero. Also, they have a short gestation period, which is kind of interesting, okay? So not only are they growing very, very rapidly, they're not taking very long between conception and birth. So if you look at the collection on the left, those are all the baleen whales. They're in the order of 10.5 to 13 months for gestation periods. If you look at the toothed whales, there are quite a few big species that have gestation periods that are quite a lot longer than that, 14 to 17 months, even though they are smaller, except for sperm whales, than all of the baleen whales. And if you look at the terrestrial mammals on the right, the biggest species, they can have gestation periods up to 22 months. So elephants, from conception to birth, is almost 2 years. Yet an elephant is just a small fraction the size of a big baleen whale. Okay, so that's in utero. And I should also shout out, for those who don't know this, PhyloPic, for those who want to do nice scientific pictures and drawings. You can download all these pictures from PhyloPic and create your own nice illustrations, just like I did. Once you're born, baleen whales are also super unusual in having unbelievably rapid calf growth. These two pictures are pictures of probably a newborn blue whale, the smallest one I've ever seen on the top, and a blue whale at about 7 months old when it's grown from 6 or 7 meters to 16 meters, 7 months. They do this by drinking mother's milk that is basically fat. So if you think of the milk we drink and your full cream milk is about 3 or 4% fat, 50% for blue whales, okay? And in the process of getting your calf from this tiny, skinny little thing to this massive, almost adult-size calf at 7 months, takes its toll on the mother. The mother becomes noticeably gaunt, uses up all of its fat reserves in the process of nursing the calf. Once the calf stops nursing, its growth slows dramatically. So you go from, blue whale go from 7 meters to 16 meters in 7 months, and it'll go from 16 meters to 20 meters in 10 years. Okay? So once that nursing period ends, the growth slows off dramatically. Why? Why all this effort to get your calf from small to big? Well, you know. Escape predation, right? Get big enough. 16 meters is bigger than a humpback whale. Okay? So why do whales migrate? All right. Does that show nicely? Yeah, that does show nicely. Lots of different whale species, baleen whale species, have this stereotypical migration pattern from a more polar feeding area to a more tropical breeding and calving and nursing area. And these migrations can be 10,000 kilometers in the space of a year, each direction. Super, super, super long migrations. Why do this? The food is nearer the poles. Why leave the place where the food is to go and have your calf? And it's got nothing to do with temperature. You don't need warm waters to have a calf. There are species that remain in polar Arctic waters, like bowheads, that don't need to go to the temperate waters to have calves. And there are small cetaceans that live in polar waters that don't die because it's too cold. If anything, it's the opposite direction. You struggle to dissipate heat when you're in warm waters. So why do this? Why not just stay around? Why do baleen whales migrate? Corker and Connor proposed that this was entirely to ensure that newborn calves are born in waters where there are fewer killer whales, and that the other arguments don't hold up. So here, for example, is the migration path of a single gray whale going from these sheltered lagoons in Baja, California, where they're born, they nurse, and then they do this migration all along the coast, all up past the US waters, through Canada, through Alaskan waters, and up into the Bering Sea through Univ Pass, passing the gauntlet of killer whales as they do this, and they stay close to shore. Conversely, something like blue whales, they also do long-distance migrations, but they tend to breed in dispersed offshore waters, even though they feed on all kinds of places. So this does offer the question, why do they have these two kind of somewhat different patterns? Why does one group of species migrate close to shore and have sheltered nursing, feeding, nursing, breeding areas, and the other whale has an offshore pattern, and they migrate and they disperse in winter? So why is that? Okay, so let's have a look at all these different species of whales and highlight the ones that migrate coastally and aggregate in bays in winter. And I'm generalizing here. This, for those whale experts in the audience, I apologize for generalizing like this, but generally speaking. And these species are ones that migrate offshore and disperse widely in winter during the breeding and nursing and calving season. Also, these exact same groups of species, the ones in red, are also species that are relatively slow swimming. They're kind of knobbly and warty, and they have callosities and bumps all over them and so on and so forth. They're bulky, but they're quite maneuverable. Versus the species in blue, the blue whales and fin whales and sei whales and minke whales, are fast and streamlined and slim and not really at all maneuverable. Okay. Well, Ford and Reeves propose that there are fight club and flight club species. And all these differences, you can divide these baleen whales into two groups. The fight club are the ones that fight back when they're attacked by killer whales. They have to be maneuverable. They have to be bulky. They're covered with callosities and barnacles and knobbles, which make them nastier to try and corral. Okay. The flight club are those that are fast swimmers. They flee when they're attacked by killer whales. So a classic example would be killer whale attacks a mother and a calf, blue whale. The blue whale goes, "Good luck, baby," swims off. And then there's an ongoing fight where the baby is trying to swim as fast as it can and get away. But no protection. The mother's not a great mother. I apologize for the slander to blue whale researchers, but it's true. And I'm one, so. And these flight club species are also the ones that go offshore and they disperse, which now starts to make sense, because if your strategy is to flee, you got to be somewhere where you could flee in all directions. If you're attacked by a killer whale and you're close to the beach, you can only flee in one direction, and if the killer whale's in that direction, you're in trouble. Whereas the fight club, it makes sense to be close to the beach, because if you're close to the beach, you can only be attacked from one direction, and you're going to stand and fight back. Now, you can't be attacked from below because it's shallow. You can't be attacked from the shore side. You can only be attacked from the seaside, and you can defend yourself much better. Okay. Now, you might think, well, this is just some kind of genetic difference between these two groups. Fight Club, Flight Club, they're just two genetically separated groups. That's total explanation. That's not true. Classically, the humpback whales are really, really genetically closely related to fin whales, even though they don't look particularly similar. The humpbacks have got the super long pectoral fins, which make them very, very maneuverable. Fin whales look very, very similar to blue whales and sei whales, but they're more genetically linked to humpbacks. So it's not a genetic difference. And the fight species come from three very, very different groups of species. The gray whales, right whales, and humpback whales all are very, very genetically different groups of baleen whale species. Now, as an aside, these two groups, these fight club and flight club species, also resulted in massive differences during the whaling era. This plot shows all of the places where the sailboat era whalers went whaling in the 1700s and 1800s. Think of the Moby Dick era of whaling, where you want a sailboat, you put your rowboat off the bottom, and then they hand harpoon the whales until they could kill them. The species they attacked were right whales, bowhead whales, gray whales, humpback whales, and sperm whales, which I'm not including in this talk, but they're basically fight club species. All of the fight club species were the ones attacked by the sailboat era because they were coastal, they aggregated, they were slow moving, they fought back. That didn't really help particularly much. Or if you read Moby Dick, of course, they would occasionally fight back and flip over a boat or something every now and again. The flight club species swam too fast. They couldn't be attacked by the sailboat whalers because they swam too fast and they sank when they were killed, and they were just too big. So you couldn't chase after them. They would just swim away, and you'd never catch up to them again. It was only when they developed the era of steamboat whaling, the coal and steam boats that could go as fast as a blue whale or a fin whale, explosive tipped harpoons, so you just needed one shot to kill them. The advent of an air pump, so you could pump air into the dead whale and keep it floating so it wouldn't sink. All those developments happened in the late 1800s and the 1900s, and that's when the flight species were targeted. Blue whales, fin whales, and then sei whales, and then minke whales, sequentially targeted and brought to the verge of extinction, at least for blue and fin and sei whales. So whaling also impacted by these differences. Okay, so now where are all the missing whale babies? Okay, you might think this is peripheral to my talk. It's not. It's absolutely not. And this came because I'm trying to write a book on blue whales. All of this came out because I'm trying to write a book on blue whales, and I keep on getting sidetracked by much more interesting things to do. And I was in the process of this, and I was chatting to Richard Sears, one of the world's foremost experts on blue whales, and he said, I've been working in the Gulf of St. Lawrence for 45 years, and in all those years, I've only seen 35 blue whale calves out of the thousands of blue whales he's seen. And he says, I think this population is not in a good place. I think it's declining. And indeed, when I went and looked up and got information from all over the world where people study blue whales and asked, how many calves do people see? Only about 3% of sightings include mother-calf pairs. Yet we know from whaling data that something like a third to a half of all of the big blue whale mothers were pregnant when they were caught. So you would expect to see a similar level of proportions of blue whale calves among the big mothers, at least those sightings. And it's not just the case for blue whales, although this is what I've looked at in most depth. Minke whale calves are even rarer. If you've seen a minke whale calf, you're in a rare and refined group of people. It's so rare that you can write an entire paper called "We saw a blue whale, we saw a minke whale calf." And I'm not talking about a paper like from 1950. This paper was from 2022 in a good journal too. Okay. And when they do surveys, like in the Antarctic, they did this big set of surveys around the Antarctic with 2 to 4 vessels every year for 3 months. They saw 25,000 minke whales, and of which there were 15 calves. And if you think blue whales have a high pregnancy rate, minke whales are like the rats of the sea. Okay, they just breed. Okay, the pregnancy rate in a minke whale is 70 to 80%. So almost every minke whale mother you encounter will be pregnant. Yet, where are the calves? Okay, so this required an explanation. And it turns out it's a timing question. Most people that work on whales and most people that do surveys on whales want to go and do the surveys at a nice time of the year. Okay, do you really want to go do a survey off this coast in January? Probably not. Okay, not only is it really uncomfortable, but because the weather is bad, you really can't see the whales because there are waves and wind and so on. You can't see the spouts, makes them very hard to find them. Okay. Also, most species of whales are more aggregated in summer when they're feeding. So feeding areas, typically they're more aggregated. Okay, and so this means that when you go and look at all of the studies done on blue whales and how many calves they saw, this here is the proportion of mother-calf pairs. That's typically how you... And all those little dots on the left are summer studies. So these are people who do studies in their summer, fall regions. The 3 little dots in the middle are the winter regions. So only 3 studies, and those very big, wide confidence intervals suggest not very much data being collected in those 3 areas. So if you think about the timing of birth and the timing of weaning, this can explain why we don't see very many calves of these species. So think about a mother is pregnant, wants to give birth. When and where do you want to give birth? Well, first of all, you certainly want to feed as much as you can and put on as much blubber as you can so that you can nurse this big chunk of a baby. Okay, so you stay in your feeding area as much as you can. You feed as much as you can, and then you leave and go on your migration, and that's when you give birth. And depending on the species, you might give birth right away. You might wait until you get to your winter calving area, like the lagoons in Baja for gray whales. Then you give birth. But now you're in an area where there's not as much study being done on whales, at least for blue whales and for minke whales that disperse. So you give birth, you nurse. When do you want to wean your calf? Do you want to wean your calf while you're back in the feeding area where there's lots of food and lots of seals and lots of killer whale prey and lots of killer whales? Or do you want to wean your calf before you get back? So your calf is not accompanying you to the feeding area and getting into trouble. It's going to be big enough and can look after itself to escape predation. And so this line, this predicted line, is this idea that if you look at the number of mother-calf pairs, you'd expect that to be much higher in winter when no one's looking at them than in summer when everyone's looking at them. So this can be an explanation for those missing calves. This is for blue whales. I suspect for minke whales, it's even more extreme because their weaning period is 3 to 4 months. Very short. Okay. So you can escape orca predation by timing births. If you're in the Fight Club group, you feed in summer, you migrate to shallow, calm coastal waters where you aggregate. Once you've reached your safe aggregations, you calf, nurse, mate, etc. Because you are in these shallow areas in winter where you're nursing and mating and so on, there's no food for you there. You're all together in the same place and probably not feeding. So most of the Fight Club species are fasting in winter. The Flight Club species, on the other hand, feed in summer and then immediately calve. So instead of waiting to get to the area where everybody calves, they might immediately calve and then do so in dispersed offshore areas. And because you're more dispersed, you could go places where there's food and feed in winter. And this indeed is what a lot of blue whale populations do in winter. Okay, timing. Okay, now the most interesting part. Why is whale song so loud and so deep for only some species? And my apologies to the bioacousticians here. I'm going to butcher your entire field. Sorry, Kate, especially. I'm going to attempt to do sound now. Humpback whales have tremendously complex song at a wide range of frequencies. Tremendously interesting. Blue whales much more boring. So these are Antarctic blue whales, and these songs are sped up 20 times, unlike the humpback songs. They're so deep that if I played them at their actual volume, you might feel the rumble in the room, but you wouldn't really be able to hear the calls. And they'll keep on doing that all day. It's only the males that do that, so it's really like mansplaining. Okay. So why is this so? Why do humpbacks have these incredibly elaborate, long, repeated songs, and why do blue whales have these very loud, simple, repeated songs? Now, you have to think about what is the purpose of singing. And I will say, first of all, that baleen whales have different types of calls, and I'm talking here mostly about the songs, these repeated songs they make to presumably attract a mate, since it's the males that make these songs. Presumably, you make these loud songs to attract a mate. But now we have a problem. If I'm making super, super loud songs to attract a mate, what stops killer whales from homing in on my songs? I mean, if I'm so afraid of killer whales, why make the loudest songs in the ocean that can be heard for hundreds of kilometers in all directions? And I hadn't really thought about that at all, to be honest. But what if you could avoid predation by singing low, deep and low? So to attract a mate, you have to sing loudly. And while I was doing my research for my blue whale book, as I said, I keep on getting distracted from this book. It may be mythical, actually writing the book. I read a paper that said, oh, killer whales can't hear anything below 1500 hertz. No, the bioacousticians all said, really? Because blue whales call only below 100 hertz, which means that killer whales can't hear blue whales calling at all. They're acoustic ghosts in the ocean. So I read this and I thought, wow, that's amazing. I should look into this. Maybe they can't hear anything. Is this true? And I found a paper that actually went and measured orca hearing ranges in an aquarium. They trained these orcas to respond to sound. They would get a treat. And they looked for at each frequency level, they would play a soft sound, a louder and louder and louder sound until the orca reacted, and that would be their threshold at that frequency level. So of course, just like us, if you hear a sound that's a very low frequency or very high frequency, it has to be loud for us to hear that. And if it's in the middle of our hearing range, it doesn't have to be particularly loud. So this curve here on the bottom is the hearing threshold, how loud the sound has to be at a given frequency. And what it suggests is that at very low frequencies, it has to be a pretty loud sound for a killer whale to hear it. The top one is a bit more complicated. That is how many orcas could hear that frequency at all. So as I went to lower and lower frequency ranges, above 1500 hertz, all of the tested orcas could hear the sounds. As you went to lower and lower frequencies, individual orcas couldn't hear it, and below 100, none of them could hear it. So below 100, definitely no hearing. 100 to 1500, maybe some hearing. Above 1500, all of them could hear at least a loud sound. Okay, so that's the audiogram is what they call it. And then I thought, wait, I have another hypothesis. Maybe all of the baleen whales call at such low frequencies that orcas can't hear them. And if you're an acoustics person, you're like, oh, no, that's not true, that's not true. I'm like, we're getting there, okay? So I went and gathered a bunch of data, and sure enough, fin whales and blue whales fit this hypothesis really, really well. There's almost no calling above 100 hertz. And the little bit there is typically very quiet little notes that you can't hear from very far away anyway. Okay, so blue whales and fin whales, yeah, totally fit the model. Let's go gather data. This is my summer. Let's go gather data for all the other species. And it turns out that that's just not true. That orcas can hear many species of whales, but there's a big difference between the fight species in red, the frequency range that they call at, and the flight species in blue, the frequency range they call at. And there are a couple others down the bottom, rhesus whales, Amura's whales, and dwarf right whales, pygmy right whales, right? That we don't know how to classify them as fight or flight. But it does seem like the fight species typically sing above 1500 hertz and could be heard by killer whales, whereas the flight species typically do not, as a generalization. Why would this be so? Well, maybe if you're a fight species and you always go to the same place in winter and you're going to fight back if you're attacked, well, I mean, you're not trying to hide. You're always in the same place. If killer whales want to find you, they know where you are. You go to the same place every year. You're in aggregations. You fight back in aggregations. But if you're a blue whale, you don't go to the same place every year. You don't want to be found. You're dispersed. You move around. So now if you could be heard, the killer whales could go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. So perhaps this explains this difference between fight and flight species in terms of how they sing. Now, you might ask, well, why don't they just call quietly? Why be so loud? So I did look at this, a bit less data that I found. There's no difference between fight and flight species in terms of loudness. Fight species are loud, flight species are loud, some fight species are quiet, some flight species are quiet. But look at this. That's gray whales, the quietest of the fight species. That's minke whales amongst the quietest of the flight species. And remember the two species that were most targeted by killer whales? Gray whales and minke whales. So perhaps even though they call at higher frequencies to some extent, they are very quiet when they do this to avoid being targeted by orcas. So that's another possible adaptation. Now I put all this together in a tried to put together the hearing range of orcas and the singing range of the baleen whales and the loudness and so on and so forth. And this is the part where I really do need help from a good acoustics person because this is very crude, and I apologize. But roughly, if you're 1 kilometer away from a calling whale, anything to the right of that dashed line represents a sound that a killer whale will be able to hear from further than 1 kilometer away. And on the left would be a sound that it cannot hear unless you're really close by. And you'll see this almost perfect division between the red circles, the fight species, and the blue circles, the flight species. So it's the combination of the frequency you sing at and the loudness that you sing at ensures that you can't be heard from very far away. Now, song complexity. Fight species typically have elaborate, complex songs, many different call types, variations from year to year. Kate Stafford has this fabulous paper on the jazz singers of the whale world, bowhead whales, where almost every single individual calls a different call in the same year, and from one year to the next, they change their calls again. Versus the flight species that have these typically very simple, loud, repeated songs, the same song every year, again and again and again. Deep and loud, deep and loud, deep and loud. Now, if you think about it, if you are dispersed and you're far away and you're trying to get a mate to come to you, the best strategy is probably, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, until one swims over to you. If you're in an aggregation, like most of the fight species are, what's your strategy for sticking out? If you say, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, when everyone's saying the same thing, it's just a cacophony. And so maybe there the pressure is, I have the most beautiful song. I can sing the most intricate song. I'm the most novel. I'm the most new. And maybe that's how they compete for a mate. All speculation, I'll admit that. I have heard of one objection that all of this is rubbish. It's all just whale size. Big whales can sing deep, small whales sing high. That's not quite true. All of these whale species, so each of these sort of set of points are populations within a species all lined up. All of these species have the ability to sing below 100 hertz. So the lower range of their singing ability is below the range an orca can hear them. But the upper range differs quite a lot. The other interesting thing about this plot, if you stare at it for long enough like I did, is that all those red dots are intermediate sizes. The flight species are both big and very, very small. The fight species are all in this intermediate size range. And I thought about that for a while. I thought, well, I guess it makes sense, because to fight back, you have to be a combination of two things. You have to be big enough to be able to fight back. If you're tiny and you try and fight back, it's useless. So big enough to fight back, but maybe if you get too big, you can't be maneuverable enough. So there's the sweet spot where you can be big and maneuverable and fight back. If you're any bigger than that, you have to flee. If you're any smaller than that, you have to flee. Just an interesting observation. One final strategy is this. You could avoid predation by just being silent. You don't have to call. You could just be quiet. And indeed, this is something that minke whales appear to do. One of my colleagues, Brian Miller, led a study down in the Antarctic where he was listening for whale calls. And he heard 60 times more blue whale calls than minke whale calls. But in the Antarctic, minke whales are 50 times more abundant than blue whales. So that suggests some combination of the distance you can hear them from, but also the calling rate must differ a lot in the Antarctic summer. And minke whales in particular seem to be very, very difficult to nail down. It was only in 2001 that we identified the mysterious Star Wars sound. In 2005, the Boing sound. And in 2014, the Bioduck sound. And if I'm lucky, I can play for you these songs that people were hearing, and they were just like, we don't know what this thing is. So let's see if I can get this to play. So this is the Bioduck.
You do if you heard this sound while swimming in the ocean.
That's the bioduck sound. Here's a boing. And my personal favorite, the Star Wars sound. Why did it take so long to figure out that these sounds are made by minke whales? Probably because they don't make them very often. And they're not very loud when they make them. So pinning down what individual makes that sound is kind of difficult. Which brings me to one final species. I have been kind of skirting past those unknown, if they're flight or fight species, O'Meara's whales, Rice's whales, and pygmy right whales. Now, O'Meara's and Rice's whales are very, very closely linked to Bruder's whales. They look like flight species. They sing at low ranges. They, look like a duck. They act like a bioduck. They're probably flight species. But pygmy right whales, boy, we don't know. Okay, these are the most mysterious of the baleen whales. They're enigmatic. They surface for a very short amount of time. They don't have a high spout. They're very hard to see. They're very, very rarely ever seen. Nobody has a good recording of what they sound like when they make calls. The only known example of a pygmy right whale call is a calf that got stuck in an Australian harbor for 6 weeks. And finally, someone said, oh, let's put a hydrophone down and see what sound it makes. And it makes a very, very quiet knocking sound like a couple times an hour. And you don't even know if that's what a natural calf would make. You don't even know what the adult sounds, what they make. No one has a good recording of what a pygmy right whale sound makes. So perhaps their adaptation is a bit like a submarine. Run silent and run deep. Okay, very innocuous surfacings, very quiet surfacings, stay underwater most of the time, don't make any calls. Maybe that's their adaptation for staying out of danger. And one final note, this isn't an entirely original idea. Predation by killer whales has also been linked to the evolution of whistle loss and narrow band high frequency clicks in the toothed whales, the odontocetes. And this is across 4 completely different families of toothed whales, porpoises, pygmy sperm whales, and so on. And what they do is either they don't have any whistles at all, or they sometimes have their whistles above the hearing range of killer whales, above 100,000 hertz. So too high for them to be heard. Okay, so I hope by now I've convinced you of the following: that orca fear may well shape amongst baleen whales their huge size, their rapid fetal growth, their short gestation, their rapid calf growth, long distance migration, the type of migration, the timing of migration, whether they aggregate in winter or not, whether they fast in winter or feed in winter, whether they have fight or flight behavior, their body shape, their swimming speed, their maneuverability, the timing of their calving and weaning, the low frequency singing, the loudness of singing, the degree of silence, the type of singing. All these things could be shaped by killer whales. If somebody will give me a lot of money, I'll prove it. I'd like to thank a whole bunch of people that helped me on this, and many, many more that are not listed here. It's been a fun project to do, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so very much. So everybody, we're going to open it up to questions. I do realize that we're getting a little close on time, so if you do need to leave, feel free to go out those back doors out the back, and that'll keep you from having to walk in front of everybody. Other than that, we're going to bounce back and forth between questions online and questions in the room. So Roseanne, it looks like you have a question. Go ahead and kick us off.
Thanks for a great talk, Trevor. I've heard that true gigantism in baleen whales is relatively recent, is within the last 5 million years. And that's sometimes attributed to changes in prey abundance. Is there any evidence linking this to the evolution of modern killer whales?
I listened to a talk many, many years ago where someone looking at the fossil record suggested that there was this period of massive radiation in cetaceans, and at about the period where killer whales evolved, the number of species in the fossil record crashed dramatically. But I listened to the talk, but I never saw a paper come out, which makes me think that maybe it didn't hold up. But there could be something there in the timing of evolution of orcas may have something to do with the evolution of gigantism in baleen whales. I'm working on a proposal right now for the Simons collaboration, Simons Foundation collaborations, and I have someone who's a paleontologist on board to look at that. So I'm kind of hoping there'll be something interesting there. But if there isn't, there isn't, you know.
All right, questions in the room. Go ahead and raise your hand.
So some years ago, I saw nature porn, and it may have been orca that were migrating from Antarctica and taking a South American cruise to shed parasites. And I don't remember if that was animals or if it was algae growth, but they were migrating ostensibly, specifically to get to warm water where these parasites were less viable. And then when they were clean, they would go back to Antarctica. And do you see any impact of anything on that regard, talking about large predators, but also those small predators in driving migration or driving migration patterns?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I think the paper in question was they tagged these orcas in the Antarctic, and they went on these rapid excursions to warmer water and back again. And when they arrived back, their skin looked beautiful and fresh and clean, because when they're down in Antarctica, they get covered with this yellow algae and all kinds of stuff, and the skin looks horrible. So yes, that may be one of the reasons why some whales do migrate, but it doesn't seem like the baleen whales do this rapid up and back migration that you would expect if that was true. But perhaps that's part of the solution. The one thing I've learned being a scientist is that any explanation you have is going to be too simple, that nature is always going to be more complex than anything that a simple hypothesis covers.
Roseanne, how are we doing? Questions online?
Uh-oh,
I'm
right. In trouble.
All right. Mariana's got the mic. Go ahead.
This is cool. I love these kind of talks. So if it's only the adult male blue whales that are vocalizing out there in the middle of nowhere, do they have anything to fear from killer whales? Are they afraid a group is going to come by and cause them some harm? If the females with calves aren't vocalizing, that makes sense. But why would the males be concerned?
Yeah, I think this is a big flaw with my idea for sure. And perhaps it's because if you're making calls, perhaps there are areas where there's good food that you're hanging around in. You make calls that attracts mates into those areas with good food, and that also some of those females will have calves as well and be susceptible to being attacked. Or perhaps it's just the general fear of attracting in winter. I don't know. Maybe this isn't the full explanation, but I do think it's part of the explanation.
All right. Other questions in the room? 1 second.
Hi, Trevor. It's not a question. It's just an add-on to this, what you're just musing about. I mean, the females carry the burden of taking the risk of carrying the calf around, right? So maybe the males carry the burden of being more acoustically noticeable. It's a split the difference type thing in ecology or evolution of these animals.
Yeah, I mean, songbirds would be a classic case where the males typically sing more and the females are more camouflaged. So in some sense, it's Zahavi's handicap principle. I can afford to sing loudly and be showy and visible because I am such a good quality male. So even though I'm likely to get eaten, if I wasn't so amazing, I wouldn't be singing like this.
All right, we've got a question online. Go ahead, Roseanne.
It's the same principle for people trying to get tenure.
Were killer whales ever hunted as during the whaling era? And are their populations increasing due to the decline of ice in the poles?
So sorry, can you repeat the first part of that?
Were killer whales ever hunted as in the whaling era?
A very good question. Not very much. There were a couple of years of Soviet whaling in the late 1970s when they caught about 800 killer whales in 1 or 2 years in the Antarctic. Bear in mind, there are something like 25,000 killer whales in the Antarctic, so it's nothing like in the North Pacific where we're worried about a population of less than 100 going down. So they're way more numerous in the Antarctic. I don't think whaling ever had a substantial impact on killer whale population sizes, except there is a paper that suggests they may have benefited from all of the whale carcasses that were killed by the whalers, because lots of killer whales learned that when you hear the harpoon going off, there'd be a dead whale waiting for you. You could go and eat the tongue out and strip some blubber off while it's being towed to the whaling boat. So there may have been a subsidy of whale food for killer whales during the whaling era. But no, I don't think the killer whale numbers were affected by whaling very much.
Okay, and then go ahead. The second part of that question, Roseanne.
Second part was, are there populations of killer whales increasing due to the decline of ice in the poles?
I don't know that. I don't know. Here's the answer.
All right, we're going to take one more question in the room, and then we'll let our speaker wrap things up. Go ahead, Dawn.
Thanks, Trevor. Fascinating talk. I'm curious. So the plot you show about the missing blue whale calves, and there's this one really anomalous point. We've talked about it extensively, and some of us in the room that comes from the blue whale population we study in New Zealand, and the killer whales. The blue whales that we observe in that feeding ground don't have killer whale rake marks, and the killer whales are not known to feed on large whales. And so I sort of use that as a premise to ask, you have a lot of support for these sort of hypotheses that you've put forward for that killer whales drive these global population or like global patterns in baleen whales. But killer whales are also quite sort of nuanced and specialized. Some populations or some ecotypes are really these baleen whale specialists, and not all these baleen whales live in places where they're faced by these baleen whale specialist killer whales. And so I'm curious if you could speak to, like, there's variation around each of these patterns, and have you dug into basically if variation in the killer whales does that align with the variation you see in the adherence of the baleen whales to this pattern?
Yeah, I wish you hadn't done that population 11 study. It was really quite annoying to my theory. But yeah, absolutely. This is a great place for a follow-on study, and part of our proposal involves looking at area by area variability and where killer whales are and are not, and whether that impacts these various changes. That would be one way of confirming or refuting these hypotheses, would be looking at area to area variability. And certainly because there are no rake marks on blue whales in New Zealand, and they seem to have lots of calves in these areas in summer, perhaps that suggests that this is one area that could be used in that kind of comparison.
Nice.
This is a very low number of data points in terms of numbers of studies, and we're hoping to get a little more for a follow-up study.
All right, we're going to wrap up there. Any last thing you want to send us away thinking about all these potential hypotheses you're putting in our brain?
I would just say that a lot of science is just fun for the sake of being fun, and the most interesting science that you do, for those that are scientists in the audience, is often the stuff that just is like a side interest or a side project that's totally worth pursuing just for the sake of knowledge. So science can be super fun. Go ahead and do it.
With that, thank our speaker. All right, everybody. I hope to see you again in the new year. Enjoy your holidays, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for being here. All right, for those online, we're going to end the presentation. Thanks so much for being here.